Hey folks. Okay, so here today I wanted to talk to you all about the color wheel again and about mixing primary colors to get your secondary and tertiary colors. I want to start with showing you some reasons why this kind of theoretic color wheel that we've all known since grammar school doesn't quite work when it comes to mixing pigments, and why in our kits we're going to be using the CMYK primaries of cyan, magenta, and yellow. So I want to start with what we think of as the traditional primaries according to the color wheel. So here on my palette I've put a traditional red, blue, and yellow. These are kind of the primaries that we normally think of and are fairly similar to how they appear on the color wheel. However, when I go to mix these primary colors, you'll see that the secondary colors I obtain aren't quite what I am looking for. So if I was going to start with trying to mix a green, for example, and I take a little bit of my blue, remember, you're always going to start with the darker color into the lighter color. So if I start with a little of this blue into my yellow, so you can see it's starting to shift here. All right, so it's starting to get a little bit more green there, but you can already see that it's going to be a bit muddy. So I'm going to add a little bit more. Okay, it's definitely looking a little bit more greenish. Add a little bit more. All right, and so you can see that these colors here are not quite matching up with what we would think of as you know, our yellow green and our green from the color wheel. They're definitely a lot more desaturated. All right, so now if I try mixing a violet and I go for the red and the blue here, just take a little bit of this red out, and I put some of that blue in. Okay, so you can see it's starting to turn into a darker red, but you can already tell it's going to be quite desaturated. It looks, this definitely doesn't have that brightness that we might think about as we go into a violet. Okay, so there's my violet. That's really not very violet at all. So this is why we're not using our traditional red, yellow, blues to mix those secondary colors. All right, so let's see what happens when we actually use our CMYK colors. So I'm going to put a little bit of each of these on the palette here. So here's my cyan. And again, just to remind you, the CMYK, C for cyan, M for magenta, Y for yellow, and then the K is for black. So a printer is going to print CMYK. Those would be the ink cartridges that you would put in a CMYK printer. All right. So this is the step that I want you to do in your sketchbooks as your color mixing practice assignment. Take a small amount of your palette of the cyan, the magenta, and the yellow, and I want you to try to mix the secondary colors, but I want you to do them as a spectrum, so from one primary to the next with many steps in between, so that we can capture those tertiaries as well. So I'll show you kind of what I mean by that as I stick my finger in the paint. Okay, so if I'm going to start, for example, with, let's say, mixing that green that we started with before. So I have the yellow, so I'm going to start the yellow. And again, this is what I want you to be doing in your sketchbooks, okay? So I'm going to start by just showing some pure yellow, all right? And I'm going to label that. I'm going to do it with marker, but you can do that with pencil. Just want to make sure you can see it. Okay, so I'm going to label that as my yellow. And then I'm going to take the smallest amount possible of my, I was starting to do orange. We're doing green. So I'm going to take the smallest amount possible of my blue, just a small dab, and I'm going to go into my yellow, and you can see how it very quickly now shifted to a nice kind of yellow-green here. So I'm going to mix it really well, and then I'm just going to make another swatch. Okay, and then I'm going to take a little bit more. I'm going to actually dab a little of that off, so I just have a little bit. And mix that in. And I'm just going to progressively work my way to more and more of the blue. Hence getting it more and more green. And already side-by-side comparison here, you can already see how the greens that I'm achieving are much more saturated, even with this video quality that isn't great. Apologize for that. You can see that I'm definitely getting much brighter, more saturated greens, and they're actually a lot more saturated in person than they are appearing on my screen. All right. And you can see here I'm starting to get to really a much more true green, that kind of Irish green that we all think about when we think about a green. I'm able to achieve here, which I wasn't able to achieve with the other pigments. So I'm just going step by step, adding more and more blue so that it can hopefully get all the way down my page. And in fact, I think I have to lift this up for you all to see it. Notice I'm not worrying about washing my brush or anything in between. I'm just kind of playing and getting, going, adding. Oh, now I just added some of that lighter stuff back in, so I add a little more blue. And you can see I'm running out of space here, so I'm gonna kind of go back up again, which is fine. Doesn't need to look particularly pretty. We just want to have the exercise of doing it. And now, I'm not sure that you can see much on the video here, but besides the fact that I'm running out of the blue on the palette, I can finally see that this green is really starting to look more blue-green too. So I think you can probably tell a little bit on the screen that it is starting to feel more and more getting back to that blue. And as I start to get, oh, that one didn't really get mixed together too well, sorry. I'm going to clean my brush, and I'm just going to do one last one here near the yellow of what the pure blue looks like. I'm going to paint over this one a little bit. I didn't quite mix that one. All right, and then you can kind of see what the pure blue looks like there. And kind of in between those, if I take the remaining blue on my palette that had just the littlest bit of green in it from when I kept kind of dipping in there without washing my brush, you can kind of see, you know, that's kind of the blue with just a little bit of yellow in it. All right, so I have now kind of a whole spread, yellow to green and back to blue. And really, instead of blue, I should say it's cyan. I'm going to label it correctly here. So that's the cyan. So what I can do now, and what I'll have you do in your sketchbooks, is then take your color wheel and hold your color wheel up to these swatches to find the various secondary and tertiary colors. So for example, if I'm looking for the yellow-green and I hold it up, and again, this helps to squint in your eye, you know, I can see here that it's a little too yellow. I can see here it's a little too dark. And right here, that's pretty much my yellow-green. So I can star that as that being my yellow-green. And then I can look for a green, and I'm going to squint my eye. And, you know, it's not going to be perfect, but it's right around here is a good green. And then my blue-green, the trick with the blue-green is it's going to be a lot darker when you mix it than it's going to appear here on your color wheel. So what you really have to do for the blue-green, to really try to mix a blue-green, is to take a little bit of white on your palette. And I'm going to take some of that kind of bluish green that I had left on my palette here. And I don't know, you know, that this was the perfect one, but I'm just going to try it. I'm going to take that and I'm going to put that into some white, making a tint. And that will really help me better see if I'm getting that kind of blue-green there. And it looks a little like it could use just a little bit more blue to me. In fact, if I turn my color wheel over and I find blue-green here, you can see it does show you also what a tint of blue-green, a shade of blue-green, and a tone of blue-green look like. But if I put this on my paper here, so that was kind of one of the last blue-greens I made, plus some white, and you can see that, I don't know how well it's showing up in the video, but that's actually very, very close. So my blue-green here, which is really a tint of the blue-green, is very similar to what's on the color wheel is blue-green. So probably one of these last ones I did, you know, probably this one and this one, would work well if I was painting a color scheme that had blue-green in it. So I'm going to star both of those as a blue-green option. So the reason that we're doing this and the reason that we're practicing on paper is that once we start painting our paintings, we're going to want to have a reference point to, you know, if we're trying to mix a yellow-green for part of a color scheme, or we're trying to mix a blue-green for part of a color scheme, or just green, we want to know what we're trying to mix. Because if we mix this green on one day and this green on another day and this green on the third day, it's not going to read as a cohesive color scheme. So we need to make sure that every time we mix green, we mix it the same way, or if we mix yellow green or blue green, that we're mixing it the same way. And that will really make our color schemes make sense. All right, so I've just done my green, which included yellow, green, and blue green. So the next one I'm going to do, would do in my sketchbook, is my violet. So for violet, of course, I'm going to be doing magenta, and I'm going to be doing cyan. But along the way, I'm also going to be getting, by doing that, I'm also going to be getting red. Because of course, if I'm using magenta, I don't have red. And you might be doing a color scheme like red, yellow, blue, or red and green, and you'll need that actual red color as opposed to magenta. I want you to be able to see, oh, well, actually, I'll show you that next. So that won't be part of the violet. That'll be separate. So, sorry, I skipped ahead mentally. I'm going too fast. My brain's going faster than my brush. Okay, so again, starting with the blue, starting with a little bit, adding a little bit. Adding a little bit more. Adding a little bit more. Just move this over a little bit so you can see a little bit more what I'm doing. So I'm just getting the littlest bit every time and mixing it in. Yeah, it's really starting to look a lot more violet on my end. I know on the screen it probably looks pretty dark, but to me, what I see is it looking a lot more violet. All right, and then I'm actually going to clean my brush here and kind of go the other way. So I'm going to take some cyan again, just plain, and I want to just take, maybe not even so much of it, just take a little bit of it. And I'm going to take some of that purple I just mixed, and I'm going to mix it into the cyan just so we can see what it looks like kind of going the other way. Maybe mix a little bit more. So now we're getting closer to the blue violet versus the red violet. It was a little too blue at first, so I just, oh, I can't even see what I'm doing here. So I just kind of tweaked it to add a little bit more blue. Then I add a little bit more blue to it. Come back up this way. A little bit more blue. Now notice when I'm adding the blue, since I'm adding the lighter color to the darker color, which of course is usually a no-no, I'm not adding it to the whole thing. I'm just adding it to a little corner so that it will actually, you know, show me a shift. Otherwise, if I try to, and I'm also going to be washing my brush, otherwise it's very hard, as you know, to take a light color and change a darker color. So I'm just taking a little bit of the color I already mixed to mix in with that blue. And I'm going to end with some pure blue, or cyan, I should say. Old habits die hard. Keep saying blue, I should say cyan, as to not confuse you guys. Okay, so here we go. So now again, I can label If I go back down, I can label. So this is my magenta, which you're not going to use any pure magenta in your color schemes. You're going to be using red. If you use a color scheme with red, you wouldn't actually be using magenta. But you may use a red violet or a violet. So I can take that red violet. Now again, the red violet is so dark. It's very hard to tell where exactly that red violet is. So really what I have to do again for the red violet is take a little bit of white, mix what I think is going to be the red violet, and then test it with some white to see if I really got there. Okay, so that looks pretty violet still to me, so I'm going to get a little bit more magenta. Let me try to make this more of a red violet. Okay, so this is what I just mixed. So that looks pretty close to a red violet right there. But I'll be able to see it better if I mix it with some white. And there we go. That looks pretty darn close. All right, so there I've mixed my red violet, so I have a darker version of it, which is without the white, and then the tint of it, which is actually what matches my color wheel. So I can label both of those with a star as being my red violet. And then for my blue violet, I can come down here and I can take a look and see whereabouts I got that blue violet, which was down here somewhere. So it still looks pretty blue, but I can see that it's pretty darn close to what I have on the color wheel. And same thing here, I could add some white, a tiny bit of white, to check that as well. So these darker colors, you often do need to add a little white to really see if you have the color mixed correctly or not. So I'm not going to show you the orange, but I would want you to do the same thing with the orange and go from yellow to magenta, finding the yellow, red, orange, and then red, orange as you go. But what I actually want to show you is how to mix a true red, and that's the last thing I'm going to want you to do in your sketchbooks. Let's get a clean piece of paper here and a clean palette. Okay, so I have my clean palette, and what I'm going to do here is I want to show that I can get my magenta into red. And the way that I'm going to do that is with the yellow. So actually, I guess this is something that you would do as part of your making of orange. So let's just go ahead and do that. So in your sketchbook, you'll have, just to kind of recap here, we've done yellow to cyan, and we found our yellow green, our green, and our blue green. Then we did magenta to cyan, and we found our red violet and our blue violet. Oh, and our violet, of course. I skipped that one, but you'll want to find that as well. So mine was down here. Again, it's hard to see it both on the camera and then without adding white to it. So I would recommend adding some white to find that. Okay, so I found all of those, and make sure you do star them, label them, so that you have them later. These will be your reference for later. And I want to see, when you take your pictures, I want to see that you labeled them accordingly. Okay, so here now I'm starting with the yellow and the magenta. And so I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to start with yellow. Okay, my pure yellow. And I can label that. And I'm just going to be taking very small amounts, just the little tip of the brush, because again, the magenta is going to shift that yellow super fast. And I'm going to start going down. And you can see it's starting to make an orange color very quickly. A little bit more. That was kind of a lot. Didn't quite mean to add that much. You really do want to just do the littlest bits at a time if you really want to really get that gradation. But that really got it into a nice orange right there. A little bit more. If you get too much on your brush, you can always tap some of it back off again. A little bit darker orange there. Try to get some of this other paint. Make use of all the paint that's on my brush here. Okay, turning into more of a red orange here. And I don't know if you can tell, but I am starting to get a color that looks an awful like that color we're not supposed to be able to mix. Red. And there it is, pretty much. I've just mixed, I don't know how much you can see it on the video, but I've just mixed basically what we think of as primary red, the red that we aren't supposed to be able to mix. So I got that by mixing the yellow and the magenta together. All right, I'm going to keep going. And I'm going to come back up and around since I'm running out of space on the camera here. All right, so it's starting to get, you know, starting to be a lot more of just a pure, getting back to being magenta. I mean, it still looks pretty darn red. So I'm going to go ahead and wash my brush. So that I can cap it with some magenta. All right, so I've gone from yellow to magenta, and in doing so, not only did I find my secondary and tertiary colors, but I also found my primary color. So going through here, I have yellow, so that's obviously a primary. Then I have my yellow orange. So if I squint my eye, I can really see that it just took the tiniest bit of magenta to get me to yellow orange. That very first one I did. And that's a mistake I see a lot in the paintings, is people adding too much magenta and really using more of an orange when they're trying to do yellow orange. So I'm going to star that as my yellow orange. And then for the orange, you can see I got there also very quickly. So already, according to my color wheel, this one right below that was my orange. So I think really probably either of these, you know, or somewhere in between would be appropriate for my secondary color of orange. And then red orange, again, comes up pretty fast, so it's right down here. I think either of these two, probably this one actually, this one already looks pretty red. So this one right here would be my red orange. So it really did not take much of the magenta at all to get me from a tertiary to a secondary to a tertiary again. And then for the red, there's kind of a lot of them, you know, here that would really work, you know, that look like a red, kind of without comparing it to the color wheel. When I compare it to the color wheel, it's definitely one of these two here that work as my primary red. And then from there, it's working, all of these other ones are working its way back to magenta. So this is why you obviously want to take magenta and put a little bit of magenta into your yellow and never try to put yellow into magenta, because it's going to take an awful lot of yellow to try to get magenta to turn into one of these secondary or tertiary colors, or to make that primary color red. All right. What was the other thing I was going to tell you? Oh, the last thing I was going to tell you was actually about the blues, and what I actually wanted to show you on the blues, and I kind of skipped this, so let's go back to that. Apologies. Is when we were mixing the violet, what happened when we mixed the violet, we started with the cyan and we made the blue violet here, and I'm actually going to switch this. So what really happened here is, now that these are drying, they're looking a little bit different. So definitely do go back and look at them when they're dry. I would say that this one, and again, this is where adding white can be very helpful. I would say this one is actually probably a little bit more blue-violet. And this one here and onto here, where I just have the cyan with a little bit of the magenta, those, probably this one in particular here, which is just has the tiniest bit of magenta, that's, you know, maybe what we think of as being more of a true blue. So we're using the cyan, which looks a little, you know, a little bit different than when we think of as a pure blue. So when it comes time to do your paintings, your color scheme paintings, if you have pure blue as one of your colors, you very likely will want to add just the littlest bit of magenta to it to make it more of a truer blue. Somewhere, you know, it's going to be somewhere in here. That's going to be more of a what we think of as that deeper blue hue, as opposed to the cyan, if that makes sense. All right, so I've been rambling here for a long time. I would like you all to break out your paints, your palette, your water, your rag. Make sure you have your color wheel. So if you don't have your color wheel out, it's going to make this a lot trickier, because the whole idea here is to be able to compare your colors as you've mixed them to be able to label them. So you'll end up with 3 different ones. You'll have yellow to cyan, right? You'll have magenta to cyan, and you'll have yellow to magenta. And then within each of those, make sure you label your primary, your secondary, and your tertiary colors. So that's all for this lesson, folks. I would like all of you to be working on these. This is would be your class time for today. So I'd like you all to be working on these to be due for next class. Please feel free to message me if you have any questions. All right, talk to you all later. Bye-bye.